The Peter Beinart piece, for those who aren't familiar with it, Peter Beinart is a liberal Zionist writer, a strong supporter of Israel and the two-state solution. And I think it's fair to say has been something of a gatekeeper on the question of Palestine, at least in sort of mainstream liberal American circles for a number of years. He wrote a book a few years ago called The Crisis of Zionism, which argued that Israel in this lobby was failing to sort of win or earn the support of a new generation of American Jews. And he had, in some ways, a quite trenchant analysis. Trenchant. He used that word recently. That's why I think it's on my mind. But he had a quite sharp analysis of the Israel lobby's failings. And he wrote this book saying, you know, basically young American Jews are turned off by Israel's illiberalism and lurch to the right. And to that extent, it was, I think, an insightful analysis. But he became an extremely dismissive supporter of the two-state solution. By dismissive, I mean unwilling to engage with, inattentive to the growing number of voices that were challenging this two-state notion. And recently, in the last few days, he published an article in Jewish Currents sort of saying basically he's reached the end of the road and he now endorses not Jewish and Palestinian statehood or separate states, but Jewish and Palestinian equality, basically conceding that those who have been arguing for a single democratic state with equal rights and restitution and reparations and so on are right or have won the argument. And I mean, my feelings on that are that, you know, I'm happy that he's reached this point. I am glad that he is, that by coming out and writing about it, he is sparking renewed interest in this issue. I think that's important, and to his credit, he's acknowledged that he has been inattentive to the views of Palestinians on this issue for a number of years, and he said he spent his quarantine sort of reading books, including my book, One Country here, which is precariously balanced on the shelf. And, you know, he said nice things about it, and I appreciate that. I think, I mean, so that's all on the positive side. The more discussion we have on this, the better. But there is frustration that it's taken so damn long, and that it takes, you know, other people have commented on this online, and I agree with them basically that, you know, it always seems to take the validation of an American Jewish person or an Israeli to say something, and then suddenly it gets this mainstream credibility when Palestinians, when scholars like, for example, Joseph Massad might have been saying them for years and years and years, but suddenly Peter Beinart says it, and it's a big topic of discussion. I mean, maybe that's just the way the world works. Yeah. You have to look at the power dynamics there. But, you know, that frustration is there because these delays in you know, the longer this is strung out, this horrible situation, the longer Israeli apartheid continues, the longer people defend it ideologically, the more people suffer and die. I mean, there are real things at stake in this. It's not just about, you know, my ego or the ego of another writer who wants to say, well, I wrote about this years ago, even though we may have done. There are real stakes involved. So if you're someone like Peter Beinart and you do have very large platforms, bigger than you know many of us have ever had, and you're using that position to maintain a status quo which is unjust, or to argue for a status quo which is unjust, you have some responsibility in that. I mean, okay, Peter Beinart's responsibility is not the same as that of, Israeli generals who order bombing in Gaza.
Yeah.
But we all are in a position relative to other people and play a role. So, I mean, I want to acknowledge that he's come to this point. I want to acknowledge that he feels that he could no longer be relevant or effective or useful advocating for the dead-end positions he had been advocating for. And he wants to remain involved, and that means sort of coming up to date with where the discussion has been going for a few years. So good for him. The important thing, I think, is that people use this opportunity to really talk about some of the core issues that are involved.
Right. Yeah. I just want to say, as an American Jew, I totally validate what you said.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
So things are, that's going to, that just really got amplified what you said.
Yeah.
It's going to get the, not only is it getting the Katie Halper show bump, but then combine that with the American Jewess bump and you're in business.
Right.
Cooking. Yeah.
No comment. I think I could only
get I don't know. Yeah.
Trouble.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. But, no, I mean, I think that's like one of those things. It's kind of like behind closed doors among friends. We can, be like eye roll, but also publicly appreciative. I mean, I'm not saying that you need to do that, but it isn't. You want to like baby steps. It's interesting because here's what I'm always challenged by, though. Like, this is an interesting thing, right? So we acknowledge that American Jews have a disproportionate influence on this, right? In the discourse, at least. So, I mean, it's a like moral judgments aside, it's a net positive, I think, right? When someone who is, for messed up reasons, definitely.
Yeah, look, I mean, one can hardly complain about winning the argument. I mean, it's like one can be, you can. I think people have fairly criticized Peter Beinart for the positions he's taken or the role he's played. I think that's fair, and I think you can make those criticisms, and you can also say, well, he's come to where he's come, and he's said it, and that's also good. But let's look at the big picture, is that we're winning the argument,
right?
And so we have to use that as an opportunity to discuss this and to bring more people along, and ultimately how we get there, is it's going to have all kinds of detours and roundabouts and so on, and that's okay. But are we moving in the right direction? And in a sense, I mean, I think, what does it signal for Peter Beinart, who I think it's fair to say has been this sort of prominent figure in the last bastions of liberal Zionism in I guess it's New York, right? I mean, sort of New York media culture and discussion and so on. Has basically said that this is a dead end, and it's I think that is seismic in a way. I mean, I want to acknowledge that without sort of giving him this sort of giving him too much agency and credit.
Right.
At the same time, acknowledge that it is seismic for this to happen. And you look at some of the reactions to it. I mean, it's just utter panic among some of the sort of liberal Zionist Israel lobby circles. Obama's last ambassador to Israel, Dan Shapiro, did this 27 tweet thread reacting to Peter Beinart's article, and from a liberal Zionist, a panicked liberal Zionist perspective, about. But I think people like Dan Shapiro are terrified that, if Peter Beinart, who I think was, when his Crisis of Zionism came out, he was sort of the great hope that he can make the case,
right,
bring the young people on, rescue Zionism, give it a sort of a new liberal gift wrapping.
Yeah, make Zionism liberal again, yeah.
Yeah, and re-legitimize it, and that project has completely, totally failed. I think that's the big picture. And so that leaves us with, a very far a pro-Israeli and Israeli very far right that doesn't see Palestinians as humans, that doesn't believe Palestinians deserve any kind of rights whatsoever, as really that is now the mainstream of Zionism. That's the mainstream of Zionism is irredeemably, horrifyingly racist. And anyone who is not willing to go along with that has jumped ship. And let's not be naive about Peter Beinart. He's someone who was very willing to advocate for and go along with, sort of an unjust two-state solution. Of course, he would call it just, but I would call it unjust because it fundamentally denied Palestinians rights in the interest of maintaining a Jewish majority state in at least part of Palestine. But the contradictions get to a point where, Peter Beinart can't defend it. And and that's a moment worth noting. It's a fairly, it's a footnote in history, but maybe one of those half-page footnotes.
Yeah.